The next speaker that I am really, really very excited to welcome to our virtual platform is the fantastic Mark Palmer. Mark's coming to us from Queen's University, Belfast, and he's just sharing his screen at the moment. He's usually a Teams user rather than a Zoom user, but we've shoehorned him into the wonderful world of Zoom for this afternoon. So everybody, please put your hands together for the fantastic Mark. Thank you very much. He's going to find the mute button. There we go.
There you go. Thank you very much.
Mark, you'll need to hit present again, just by the way.
Thank you very much. That's us now. Thank you very much, Sarah. And thanks for inviting us along to present today. So I'm probably going to gallop through the slides. So I apologize in advance for that. And also I need to acknowledge a person in the Department for the Economy, Lorraine Fleming, who probably invented this title. So the title I would attribute not to myself, but to Lorraine, which is to rip the plaster off or keep it on. And really what I'm hopefully want to do today is really discuss a little bit about the different dimensions of what that actually might mean. I'm not like John Crawley. I'm not going to start off with music. I was thinking what I have in my office to see you know, whether I could start off with something else. And I do have something, a little instrument over there that I would use with my students, it's like a sticky labeling machine, but when I'm talking about labeling, etc. But I'll probably not use that now, but just to say thanks very much, everybody, just in advance for listening. Okay, so I suppose, you know, I wasn't necessarily aware of the audience, so just to say that by way of introduction, I would like to outline some of the basis of trust from my perspective in terms of the literature, but also in terms of where the work I have been doing over the last probably 5 or 6 years in respect to institutions and how they work and how that links into the trust dynamic. But it's very clear when you look at the literature, there's 3 main areas of trust. You know, they separate it out very clearly. There's trustworthiness, trust propensity, and trust. And if you look at all of the different definitions, there's the really strong theme that comes through is action. So I suppose using the Latin here, acta non verba, so actions, no words. So it's very much about doing, but I suppose also extending that out to, you know, what you do and what you don't do, what you say and what remains unsaid is important there. But you can see there are ideas around ability or benevolence, such as whether you're believed or not. And so that speaks into certainly ideas around authenticity and also integrity, and the willingness to rely on others and making one feel, I suppose, and accept vulnerability in relation to trustees. And, you know, if you look a little bit further into the literature, you'll see, you know, there's the basis of trust is very much based around, you know, the level of competence that individuals have. And the nature of the character, again, the idea of whether you're believed or not. And really, you know, I wanted to outline that because that's really not the perspective that I'm going to look at trust. You know, because if you look at the field of trust, it is predominantly dominated by studies on social psychology. And they take quite an individualized view of trust. So trust emanates from individuals, and you know, that's probably the most dominant kind of idea within that field. Where this kind of, I suppose, presentation is going to go in terms of the direction of travel would be in relation to how that extends across institutions and what that means when we do extend it across institutions. And yes, it can be individualized, but it can also span across institutions and different social relationships. And when we think about trust and how individuals, I suppose, ascertain that, one of the areas that I'm going to focus in on is this idea of sociality moments. So, how trust is ascertained, or how people kind of view trust. And I know earlier there, I think it was Catherine that was inputting different keywords, which is really interesting. But she also mentioned, and Ludwig also mentioned, the idea of values, and I'm sure others have as well. And we do know that values are really, really important when it comes to institutions. In fact, rarely does anything become instituted unless it is value-led, and that's kind of linking into this idea of where individuals' values and how they perhaps view trust, and we see that when individuals don't know one another and they're interacting in these sociality moments, they're calibrating, they're assessing individuals. And what we know from the literature is that they thin slice. So this thin slicing is a process by which individuals make very quick assessments, typically within the first 5 minutes. And there are different ways in which we do that, cognitively speaking, but we can do that either stereotyping, activation, or expectation kind of effects, or self-fulfilling prophecies. And what I would like to do is kind of extend that out a little bit to understand, when you look at the literature, you can see that those sociality moments are really important for trust and building trust and thinking about that. But what we do observe from the institutional literature, and I think this is what's really interesting in terms of bringing both those literatures together, is that it's also about the kind of what people have referred to, Clark and Newell in particular, the rumblings on or the rumblings in. And we're going to explore that a little bit and expand what that means. It's quite an interesting idea, I think, because ultimately, when we're talking about trust from an institutional perspective, it's not clear-cut, and it's not spliced, and it's not compartmentalized, and it's not bracketed, and it spans right across institutions. And the inferences are both verbal and non-verbal, and there are multiple cues in relation to that, or what we sometimes in academia refer to as proximal indicators or proxy indicators. We look not just what people express, in terms of what they're telling us, but also the latent behaviors. So the behaviors you can't see, or the indirect indicators. And typically we do that as human beings. So it's not just academics that look at this, but we actually do it on the street. Streetwise individuals will do it as well when they're kind of calibrating the extent to which they can trust. So that kind of brings us all back. So that's the background, the theoretical background, as it were, brings it right back to kind of the idea of whether we kind of think about what does that actually mean if we have a situation, a sociality moment where we're either rumbling on or rumbling in issues, whether that's upstream, midstream, downstream, or in any walk of life. Do we kind of think about exploring it more, or do we kind of leave it and keep the plaster on? And what might happen if you do explore it more, and what does that mean in terms of opening up institutions, old remnants, past, the history, scars? Because we do know from studies that when you bring forward anything new, whether that's a new policy, a new clean technology, or a new practice or tool, it puts the spotlight right back onto the institution. And in particular, it opens up that idea. So the plaster might have been on and it might have been rumbling along, but if somebody peels it off, then we start to open up issues that, quite frankly, we may not want to discuss or highlight. Then on other occasions, there might be a question around whether you actually keep it on, and if so, what might that do? So there's upsides and downsides in relation to that, whether that might lead to subversive behaviors, whether that leads to particular tensions, whether those tensions are negative or positive, whether it even leads to conflict, whether that's task conflict or relationship conflict, and how do you resolve that, and how do you find workarounds? So I suppose that brings us to what I would say is, if we think about those sociality moments and we think about these two, I suppose, questions, whether we keep it on or off, then we're also really speaking to, would you trust somebody to rip a plaster off? How ready are you to be prepared for somebody to rip a plaster off? Or would you rather them just go away and leave you alone and keep it on? And so that speaks very much to the idea of readiness and institutional readiness and individual readiness, and a readiness right across the board in terms of institutional trust readiness. And I suppose that kind of opens the door to, when we're speaking to trust, we're opening the door to, power dynamics, or we would say in this part of the world, power. But power, and it's not removed from trust and the dynamics of trust. Though if you look at it purely from an individual psychological perspective, it can be removed. But if you look more generally from an institutional perspective, you see that in fact can shift. And so I posed that question, and then I posed the same question. And I noticed, Levine, you had a cat on your table at one point, and it looked very lovely. But the question is, would you trust this? But then I have to pose the question: what if you were like this 1 second, nanosecond, and then you became this, and then you reverted back to that? And what about if you went back to this scenario? Because that effectively is what way social practice and institutions work. They're fluid. And so, it's not a simple category. It's not a simple saying, well, this is how you, in my view, this is how you build trust, because the individuals can shift and also the institutional environments can shift. So I'd like to kind of, highlight a few examples of that, and then probably speak to 3 main institutional environments where that dynamic can happen, and what that means for trust and building trust. So again, looking at it more from an institutional perspective, there's the idea of a leap of faith, and that's fuzzy uncertainty. And so if you bring it back to the extractive sector, and individual attitudes or stereotypes or affiliations associated with that, again, it depends where you stand. It depends on your stance, and it depends where you're sitting in an institution and who you are. Some people might view it very negatively. Some people might view it very positively. And so there's that sense of, where are you in that kind of interaction? But what we do discern from this, and certainly I discern it, is the idea that when we're thinking about trust, it's very much about opening opportunities and creating opportunities for interaction. And the more you can create interaction, and the more you can create that kind of familiarity with one another, the more trust opens. But of course, it's not a neutral environment. There are other social dynamics in that environment, and that's where you find, for example, this is one of the classic lines. You may have read it before, but it relates to the City of London and trust building in the city of London. I won't give you a loan myself, but I will walk arm in arm with you across the floor of the stock exchange, and you soon shall have willing lenders to spare. And that, in many ways, is the essence of what we're speaking to here in trust and institutions, because it's not an individual idea. It's something that spans right across, and it's not just in the spanning across of the institutions, but in the actual sociality moments where you are with individuals or as a group, or as an institution, and it comprises a whole, perhaps a collective sense of individuals across institutions, whether that's businesses or government or trade associations or other stakeholders. And the other thing to bear in mind about sociality moments is that they tend to open. They tend to, rupture. So they don't just kind of like, it's not like you can just order them. They are very messy. And so what we find is that, that is not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily a negative thing, but we would define them as these open moments where opportunities and risks can multiply. And so it can be very positive. You can grasp lots of opportunities when these sociality moments rupture. But it can also lead to disparities in terms of different views or expectation gaps. And those can either narrow, widen. Sometimes the level of social interaction can intensify as well. On occasions, what we're observing in our initial preliminary work is really that you can build scaffolding, social scaffolding, and I know Ladine mentioned this in terms of the gaps, closing that gap and the bridging, but those can be dismantled as well in these moments. And I suppose the image there that I'm illustrating is that when you start engaging in the sociality moments, you're effectively shedding light on to these rupture moments. And institutions, just like this light coming in through the window, will obviously respond in different ways. And that can be positive, and it can also be negative, because in shedding light and in socially rupturing in these moments, you're effectively shedding light on your vulnerabilities, on the deficiencies within your institutions, whether it's a new technology, whether that's a new policy, whether that's any sort of social engagement, a stakeholder workshop event. You're effectively bringing light onto your institution, and that has, of course, implications. Some people close the curtains and they say, well, we don't want that. But if you look in the literature, and we published a paper a few years back now, but we started it about 5 years ago. So that just tells you, it gives you an indication, and tells you a little bit about the publication cycle in social science. But there are two different ways of thinking about repairing that sociality gap or sociality moment. So you can do that through small scale repair. So if you think of that sociality moment as a social breach, it's rupturing in some way. So you can repair it vis-a-vis normative judgment. So you evaluate and you talk to people and you discuss, or you might use a particular tool. It might be an environmental impact assessment, or you might enforce certain rules. They might be institutionally policed, for example, by a regulator. But effectively, that's the small scale institutional breach. If you take a look at more larger scale institutional breaches, you find that they are in relation to the public consultation processes, public inquiries, and judicial reviews. And as you know, that this plaster is not easily just stuck back on again. It tends to be quite a long process. So we've got images here of the High Court, but on the converse opposite side, you have really rules, and individuals institutionally can police those rules within institutions. But then I suppose the big question then becomes, in terms of repair, is repair always possible? And if there's a wall of silence, is it possible to repair trust? Is there a lot of noise, and that noise could effectively be silence? And if that scenario exists, how do you actually repair it? And is it all lost in that environment? So what I want to do now is really show you how that might be configured across different institutional environments. So there are three broad institutional environments, just quickly then. we're using Whitley's business environment schema. Particularistic, so that's the more paternalistic kind of institutional environment. Collaborative institutional environment, where institutions come together, sometimes they lock together and interact together. And then arm's length, so that's where the government are effectively at arm's length, and they act more as a regulator. Now, the reason why I highlight those different configurations, because it's really, really dangerous indeed. I would probably caution to generalize around trust environments, because the more you kind of start looking at the different ways in which institutions work and the way in which they're all nested and interlocking together, you find that it's important to qualify how you think about trust in different environments. So in this environment, the particularistic environment, you see the trust is built very slowly. It moves very slowly. It's about very much, if you look at the vocabularies that's used, it's who you know, not what you know. If you look at how people access trust, it's very much about interacting with a friend of a friend, or through another possible contact, and really how that trust is reinforced and kind of ordered is very much through binded expectations. So in other words, you said you were going to do something, then you do it, or we're family, you know what that means. So this familiarity is really important, but also what's important in this paternalistic environment is the quid pro quo tests. So you find that actors in this environment will test, if I do something for you, you do something for myself. And what you'll also observe is the informality in that environment as well. And that's how trust is built in this particular environment. In the collaborative environment, trust building is very, you can see there's a different set of behaviors and practices, institutional practices, much more about networking, network finding, linking, affiliations, and there's a high degree of sociality. So it's very much about, are you with us, or are you against us? Are you in the in group? Are you in the out group? And probably everybody has experienced that, across any institutions that you've been working in, right the way through your whole life course, whether that's in your formative years at school or college, and the whole way through your different work organizations or institutions, as it were, but also right down to we're finding evidence in relation to, the accent that you speak. That is shown, if you look at Gerger's kind of studies recently there in the Journal of International Business Studies, you find that it's very, very obvious that, the accent also has a dynamic there in terms of collaboration. And we also note that it's both formal and informal. So that gives you a sense of really that particular environment. And then the third environment is much more arm's length, and it's much more transactional and legally sanctioned. And typically what you find in those environments is transitional outcomes. So it's the means to the end, or the end to the means. It's that kind of trade-off. What's more important? Do you reach the outcome, or is the process more important? And also that kind of idea of, you engage with stakeholders, but it's a one-off engagement, and it's very much about tallying things up, how much you've won, what you've grabbed, and how you can then show it. And there's much more about kind of that formal aspects associated with that. I'm looking at Sarah. Are we okay with time?
We don't have a huge amount left, Mark.
Right. I'm gonna speed up now. So effectively, what you see there is, if you're looking at proxy indicators for trust or practice tools, the idea of the motivation is, and you perhaps haven't heard this phrase, or you might have heard this phrase: you do the business, or the business will do you, because it's effectively a transaction. It's do the business, or we don't trust you, and that's very much ordered in terms of how people kind of think about trust in that environment. Now, if we think about what that actually means in terms of both standardized and personalized approach to doing business across institutions, or the relational aspects and the transactional aspects. What we see is just like the little, I suppose, two images that I showed you with the tiger and the pussycat. These are not static. What happens is individuals can switch, and they can switch quickly between an arm's length arrangement to one that's much more paternalistic, and then back to an arm's length. And so what we're doing is we're going to try and understand that a little bit more. Plus, collaborative, there might be different elements to that collaboration, in terms of there might be much more of a relational standardized approach to how you build relationships versus a much more personalized approach. But that might depend, for example, on the size of the institution, and again, what level of paternalistic kind of, I suppose, environment that you're operating in. So I want to leave probably today with a number of lessons to take away, from our kind of analysis so far. The first is, when you were thinking about trust building considerations, it's very much about the configuration of the institutional environment, and that will shape how trust building happens. Secondly, the social interaction is very much the basis upon which trust is built, and that social momentality or moment is not clean cut. It's quite messy. So what that does is sometimes the plaster, taking it off or you're putting it back on again, may actually not hold, because you might have a scenario where markets and the social flow evolve. Third lesson to take away is it's not just what's visible that's important. It's also the invisibility. And we've written a paper, myself and colleagues, on what we describe effectively as articulation work. So in terms of building trust, it's not all what you see. It's not the visibility. Building trust also happens where nobody sees you doing anything, and therefore in that backstage or a kind of back room, if you think of a theatre, you have effectively a whole range of individuals working backstage, working. And I think that's really important, particularly in terms of the art of quiet influence and the invisibles, and we see that there are probably less of that, or there's less of that in the digital era, where people want to show, and there's that kind of quest to do so. The other kind of key lesson to take away, there's only one more after this, Sarah, so don't panic, I'm nearly wrapping up, is the idea of zero trust. And we see this with breaches in data. So the data breaches, so some of my colleagues in the computer science area are looking at this in terms of what happens when you're in an implicit trust zone, where the entire system is not to be trusted and not trustworthy. And the other, I suppose, point to bear in mind, where would you see that, and how would you look out for the proxy indicators of that? And so again, we've done a little bit of work on this. It's about 10 years old now, looking at the counter movements in terms of for every social movement, there's invariably a social counter movement, and that brings us on to the last lesson, which we're drawn really in from what's known as the Lamy report, which the government in the UK is adopting, and that is effectively where there's disparities in any institutions linked to any of their policies, that it's the expectation is on the institution to explain or change, explain or reform. So if you want to build trust, you explain, you provide explanation within your institution, or you change. So just to conclude then, at the outset, we posed the question, do you rip the plaster off or do you keep it on? And I suppose the initial conclusion is that that will depend on the condition of institutional trust readiness. The second, I suppose, initial conclusion is that these sociality moment ruptures, that one should think very carefully. One should think very carefully about doing it yourself. The first principle of any social engagement is to do no harm. And therein is the kind of, I suppose, the salutary lesson, I think. And also posing the question around, this old world, the City of London, whether that still exists and whether the institutional traditions continue to flourish, despite the digital age, despite datification, despite those trends. And what we are observing, certainly in upstream, midstream, in B2B, that environment still matters. The institutions are really important. And the other thing to bear in mind, I suppose, in the conclusion, is to think about the practice of the power dynamics. So how individuals switch. And so I showed you the example of the two, and I'm not singling you out, Sarah, where you might, I suppose, move from being, having a particular approach to trust and then switching away from that. So the alternatives, or how the individuals might empower themselves with data, or indeed the breach in a professional status, or even the social kind of dimension of trust. And then just finally, probably something that you could take away from this presentation is the role of intermediary institutions as a first responder to that plaster being ripped off. Those institutions can provide a really useful role when there is a level of, or a lack of, trust. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you, Sarah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mark. Everyone, please put your hands together for the fabulous Mark Palmer. Thank you very, very much. Absolutely brilliant.